Hello everybody, my name is Dr. Laurie Parsons of the Royal Holloway Department of Geography, and I'm here to talk to you over the next half hour or so about a phrase you may not have heard before, and that is carbon colonialism. Before we get on to carbon colonialism though, I'm going to start us off with a even more fundamental question. That is, why do we disagree about climate change? Because it can seem in many ways like climate change is an open and shut case. Forest fires, dying wildlife, huge sustainability issues which define ecology around the world. And it can seem like the only people who are really opposing climate change are people who really have an interested perspective, who have really bad motivations. This was something that played out a few years ago during the Donald Trump presidency, when figures like Greta Thunberg and Donald Trump seemed like they were the two poles of morality and sustainability. But in reality, it's a bit more complex than this. If we look at the presidency of the current incumbent president, Joe Biden, for example, Greta Thunberg doesn't have a huge amount better to say about him. Sure, he talks the talk, but the actual tangible impact, although it's a lot more than previous presidents, is not enormous. And then we can think about some people who are even fated around the world for their sustainability and climate change impacts and that of their work, such as William Nordhaus here, the Nobel Prize winning economist for his green growth models. Greta Thunberg doesn't like him at all. So if she's so fundamentally opposed to so many of these figures in the political landscape, perhaps it's a Greta problem, but no, in fact, we can see that other high-level important figures within the sustainability and climate change landscape are equally opposed to many of the scholarly perspectives on climate change that dominate our thinking today. So all of this can be quite confusing. In reality, there are as many different perspectives, as many different opinions on climate change as there are people. So in order to understand what carbon colonialism means, we need to think about how those voices, or some of them, become dominant in our global debates. And that's one of the things we're going to be looking at doing today. First though, this is a big topic and it can seem in many ways overwhelming. So I'm going to try to bring it down to the particular familiar example of the UK, which is not only the country in which many of us live, certainly where our Royal Holloway University is, but also one of, by all accounts, the fastest decarbonisers in the world. At any environmental event, at any global climate meetup, you'll hear whoever is in charge of the UK feting the huge achievements of the great British people in reducing carbon by almost 50% in the last 20 or 30 years. It's in many ways a huge success story, and it is certainly treated as such. In fact, it's such an impressive achievement in many ways that carbon levels are now in the UK at the same level as they were in the 1890s. And that's really quite remarkable when you think about it. This is what 1890s London looked like. We've now reduced our net carbon output down to those same levels. So surely, if we can have a 21st century lifestyle whilst having a 19th century carbon footprint, surely we're getting something right. Well, let's unpack that a bit. Because in reality, it's not just the UK that's making these same gains. We can see similar downward trajectories, not quite as big, not quite as impressive in other countries such as the EU, for example, and also the United States, which despite having been called critically insufficient in its efforts by global carbon monitors, nevertheless is reducing its carbon footprint now rather than increasing it as it had done for the last 200 plus years. So what many people think is that this reduction in the leading emitters around the world of the carbon footprints that are being reported means that we're moving towards a wealthier, greener future. From the perspective of many people, this means that we're looking towards something like this, a green utopia, with the same benefits and the same amenities that we have around the world, in its richer parts rather, today, but just without the carbon emissions, without the sustainability problems. And this is such a widely shared viewpoint that we almost have to stop ourselves and think, how true in reality is this? Is there a problem with this narrative? So let's take a bit of a closer look. We've taken a stop in the momentum of our narrative on sustainability and climate change, and now it's time to unpack where we've really moved towards. Because all of the people that make these points, that oppose the Trumps and even the Bidens and even the William Nordhauses of this world, are not coming from nowhere. They're not simply being uptight and not simply arguing for the sake of arguing. In reality, global CO2 levels are not looking quite as rosy as those reduced emissions that we see in the national accounting statistics. So if we look at the global carbon concentration, we can see that even as these massive global meetings have happened, as we've seen more and more countries agreeing to ever more rigorous and tighter environmental regulations. From 1972, the world first conference on climate change, the UN Framework Convention on Climate in 1992, Kyoto in 1997, Copenhagen in 2009, and Paris in 2016, and then of course COP26 in Glasgow back in 2021. All of these have agreed ever more rigorous frameworks, and yet, despite that, look at what happens to that atmospheric carbon concentration. That's the red line there. It just keeps going up and up and up, despite 50 years of agreements on climate. So clearly something doesn't add up. And that's a key problem for people who want to make sure they make really effective action on the climate. It's also a key conundrum to understand how come all of these leading emitters like the UK, like the EU27, like the USA, are reducing their total emissions, whilst globally the amount of carbon going into the atmosphere just continues to accelerate. After all, if the biggest emitters reduce their carbon footprint, surely that will be good news for the world's carbon output. But the problem is, what these kind of models don't take account of is that huge changes have happened in the last 50 years, not just in the way that we use carbon, but the way that our economy has developed. Whereas countries like here in the UK used to be massive manufacturers, our economy was based on factories which made things. That's no longer the case. Now, in the last 50 years, the vast majority of our manufacturing has moved offshore, away from the UK, into places such as Southeast Asia, East Asia, which have become the powerhouses of our global economy. Now, why does this matter, and what does it have to do with carbon emissions? After all, it's all the same carbon wherever it gets emitted in the world. It doesn't really matter which chimney it comes out of. Well, the fact is that there's a nuance to why this matters, and I'll show you what that means. If we compare where we were in the UK in 1990, only 14% of all of the emissions that we produced as an economy happened outside of our borders. Now that's a very different picture today. Now, if we look at the situation today, it's almost certainly more than half of all of the emissions that we produce as an economy. So what does that mean? Ultimately, it means that the goods that we use are now overwhelmingly produced quite far away from where we finally use them. We have these long, complex supply chains of tens of thousands of kilometers in many cases. Essentially, the factory that we use to produce the goods that we depend on has become a global factory. It's no longer a single factory, like a single building in the industrial part of town. Global factories span multiple countries. Just think about a single cotton t-shirt, for example. You may be wearing one now that says Made in Cambodia on it. Now, if your t-shirt says Made in Cambodia, that t-shirt has only known Cambodia for a brief period. The cotton almost certainly didn't come from Cambodia because Cambodia has almost no cotton fields. In about 95% of cases, it will have come from China. But even if it comes from China, that doesn't mean it came originally from China, because China is not only the biggest producer, but also the biggest importer of cotton. So your cotton in your t-shirt, which briefly knew Cambodia, could have actually had a journey all the way from the United States, from Brazil, from the Ivory Coast, or from Australia. And if we add all of that together, it means there's 14,000 hidden kilometers of raw materials traveling embedded in that t-shirt before it even starts the journey to you in the UK. So what does this mean? It means that many of your clothes and many of the goods that you depend on are in fact better traveled even than you. They've got even more extensive passports than perhaps you do. But the key problem is not just that we need to be jealous of the jet set lives of our commodities and the things that we wear, but rather that we've lost the ability to track where all of these goods come from. Whereas in previous years, we could say clearly that if we had a particular garment or car, for example, or a particular electronic device, then we could say, well, we know exactly where that comes from. It comes from a factory in Leeds, and we can go and look at that factory. Today, these factories are spread all around the globe, almost all outside of our borders. So that means we lose the direct oversight that we used to have over the goods that are made in those factories and the way that they're made and the impacts of their being made. All of that carbon happens outside of our borders, so we can't directly measure it. We depend on what supply chains tell us. We can only indirectly measure and compile it. And essentially, this means that we have no direct oversight. We have no direct image of what's happening in our exploded global economy because it's no longer within our direct jurisdiction. And this has fundamentally changed the game on sustainability. Our globalized economy has outgrown our ability as leading economies, as major economies, to actually rigorously monitor them, at least under the current system. And the result of this is that we get situations like this. Now, what you're seeing here is a video taken from a factory in Cambodia. Cambodia is a place where we import 4% of our garments from, and they export 25% of everything they make to us. So we're a major import destination for Cambodians. And this here is a garment factory. What you're seeing is thousands upon thousands of tons of illegally deforested wood being used to burn boilers to iron the shirts that end up in your wardrobe. Now, every single brand that you will buy your t-shirt from will say, absolutely, we have a zero deforestation policy. They will say, absolutely, that we have no waste being sent into landfill. And yet, you can see before your very eyes thousands and thousands of tons being used in your supply chains. And that's because we've lost that direct oversight. It's no longer possible to monitor what goes on, control it and regulate it in the same way that it was 50 years ago. Our economy has outgrown our capacity to sustainably manage it. So this means that we don't end up solely with deforested wood being entered into our supply chains. It also means that we end up with things like this, which is garment offcuts and waste being thrown into huge burners in order to produce electricity. We also end up with situations like this, such as massive garment dumps. This is one in Cambodia. You can see how huge this is. The tiny truck is included in there somewhere, and even tinier people. There's about 100 people working on this dump, and it's by no means unusual in the world of garment production. Chile's deserts, for example, are filled with these kinds of garment discard spaces, essentially out of sight, out of mind, and completely unannounced in the labels that you will see in your UK products. And it's not only garments. The same thing that we can see for other products. For example, one thing that you probably won't know that we are world leading at in the UK, it's not something that tends to be announced, is that we are the world's #1 importer of bricks. We import 400 million bricks every year. And of those, 30 to 40 million come from outside of the EU, predominantly from places like this in Bangladesh, Pakistan, India. Now, this is a massive carbon problem. Every single container of bricks that comes the 18,000 kilometers from South Asia emits 600 tons of carbon on its way. That's the equivalent of the weight of 5 blue whales of gas for each container of bricks. If we were doing this as a domestic industry, we would never allow this kind of high carbon production process to take place. But in reality, because it's outside of our borders, it's no longer fully part of our responsibility. Out of sight, out of jurisdiction, and in many cases, out of mind. It also means that when the worst impacts of climate change happen around the world, such as the very dangerous areas of tea plantations in the Sri Lankan highlands, we're able to say that isn't our responsibility. Many of these tea plantations where landslides kill many people every year are literally owned by British companies. But of course, it's not the responsibility of the companies how dangerous these are. Again, no one sees these kind of dangers on the side of your packet of tea that you have your morning cuppa. So this is the situation we're faced with. In the last 50 years, we've seen an explosion of our economies into these vast complex webs which bestride the world. They've reshaped our ability to make things, made it in many cases far cheaper, and this is at the root of the kind of high consumption culture we now live today. But what gets talked about far less is that we've lost so much of our capacity to visualize what's going on in these supply chains. We have abstract ideas about them. We can see pictures like this, we can see company reports, but our ability to actually see, actually inspect, and actually know what's going on is very much reduced. All of that efficiency has come at a sustainability cost. But I like to go back a little further than the last 50 years when thinking about this and look at the roots of this issue. Because this process of globalisation that has accelerated so markedly in the last 50 years is in reality not something confined to that half century. It has its roots far longer ago. In reality, in the late 18th century and early 19th century, when we began to see the explosion of interest in a very important commodity at the time, and that commodity was cotton. Now, a lot gets talked about in the kind of 16th, 17th, 18th centuries around the slave trade and the sugar plantations that drove it. Something that's less appreciated is that cotton was equally important in driving this globalization of the slave trade. Let me show you what I mean. In around 1800, there was huge demand in the UK for cotton. But the problem was that the Chinese and Indian markets absolutely had this sewn up. They could produce incredibly high quality cotton incredibly cheaply. So this meant that we had what's known as a balance of payments deficit. It meant that we were sending out loads and loads of money to Asia and getting back goods. And that's good for Asia, less good for us in the UK, or at least so the governors at the time thought. So they thought this is a problem. We're losing our good British pounds out to the Asian market. We need to take control of our demand for cotton. Now, around the same time, there were massive technological leaps in the UK, such as the invention of the spinning jenny and the Watt steam engine, which massively increased the capacity of factories to do work. So what this meant is that we, in theory, had the capacity to make massive amounts of cotton on our own. But there was only two problems. we couldn't grow cotton, and we didn't have the people to grow cotton either. So what this led to was the development of a huge global system of globalized trade, which continues to define the world today. We found places to grow cotton, specifically in the south side of North America. And we found the people to grow it, specifically from Africa and from the West Indies, where we imported huge numbers of people, millions and millions of people enslaved and transported to work in this global cotton factory. Now, the legacy of what happened during those years, the division of capital, which remained here in the UK, of people which were moved from predominantly Africa to areas such as North America, and of land which was again captured and reallocated to the global economy from the American South, continues to define the way that our global economy works today. And that's something that's very important, but sometimes underappreciated in what we know about carbon emissions and the climate. This is a map of the vast network of logistics that underpin the global factory. Some of these ports are so big that they import over 500 million tons of goods every year. There's this vast complex web underpinning the flows of goods and of money around the world. And it's this vast complex web which had its origins in the explosion of the global economy, not just 50 years ago, but beginning almost 250 years ago, and which continues to define the emission of carbon around the world today. Because one of the things that you'll hear from those very many opinions that we saw early on in today's talk is that there's just too many people around. It's something that we often hear. And it's in many ways really convincing, because we have seen a huge explosion of our global population. There's 8 billion rather, of us around the world today. And this seems to correlate fairly effectively with the huge amount of carbon that we're emitting. But in reality, the human race has been around for an awfully long time. And if we look at carbon concentration over that period, it's far less convincing. Human race has been around 200,000 years in its current form. But that carbon only started to skyrocket, as we can see in this graph here, in the last 200 or so years. So something massive changed. That's the key difference. Something huge changed along this way. So what was it? If we look at the statistics around the world today, one thing we can say for sure is that people don't emit carbon at anything like the same rate. If we compare how much carbon an average Ethiopian person emits, for example, and we compare it to what an average Brit or an average American emits, the difference is around 150-fold. So one American is worth 150 Ethiopian carbon emitters. Now, what does this tell you? To me, it says that there is a real disconnect between the idea that people equals carbon and a much more convincing case for the idea that in reality it's money that equals carbon. And that's why we have to connect these historical processes of globalization to what we see happening around us in the atmosphere today. And this is also important, not just because we can look backwards and understand why we arrived at the place we are today. It's important because this question defines how we think about the future. The path we are currently on, as we saw in that earlier part of the presentation, is very much one in which we can get richer as a planet and also get greener. That's the status quo. But many people are increasingly beginning to question that. They're saying that if we actually look at how wealth is accumulated around the world, it's almost directly linked to the extraction of materials. If you take a graph of the global material extraction and you look at a graph of global economic growth, then they almost directly converge. One almost exactly fits the other. It's uncanny. This is true historically up until around 1990, when for one tantalizing period of around 18 years, it appeared like growth and material extraction were beginning to diverge. And this absolutely supercharged the enthusiasm around this idea of green growth, that we can have sustainable extraction going forward, and indeed sustainable growth. And you can see it on this graph here, that for a while we began to see a slowing of extraction even as global growth increased. However, in the 2008 Great Economic Recession, all of that changed. You can see how things snapped back into lockstep, and actually material extraction began to outpace economic growth once again. So these two lines that have tracked each other throughout history are back in lockstep. They're back absolutely mirroring one another. And because of that, there is a significant drive to question whether we can continue to grow along the same model as we do today, and in fact get richer whilst also getting greener. A lot of people are increasingly questioning this at all. And what this essentially sets up is what some people call a climate battleground, or as the very famous climatologist Michael Mann calls it, the climate war. Essentially those between the war between those who minimize the impacts of climate change and direct solutions towards the status quo, and those who argue that we need radical change in the way that we shape our economy. Because the green movement is by no means an alliance. In many ways, it is the opposite. It's a conflict between people who want growth in the status quo and achieving sustainability that way, if possible, and those who want a change in the status quo to achieve sustainability that way. It's a massive conflict, but you often don't see it this way, and a lot of that has to do with the way that we receive information and the way that power exists around global discourse and in the global economy. Because somebody like Greta, who may well be a superstar, she's just one person, and ultimately she has no special economic backing behind her. She's just become kind of a celebrity. There are millions and millions, if not billions, of young people who feel the same as Greta, but like Greta, they have zero backing, and that's why there's only really one or at most a handful of young activists like her. Equally, groups like Extinction Rebellion, who are again advocating for this huge, rapid change in the global economy, are unfunded except by donations. And then on the other side, we have huge, highly influential backers such as Bill Gates here, who has 5.8 billion associated with his Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which pursues essentially a green growth strategy for sustainability. We have people here like the CEO of Gazprom, who has 72 billion of annual revenues behind him to make the sustainability case that he likes. And of course, Gazprom, like every fossil fuel company, does make a sustainability case. This is important for us to be aware of. Just because things sound green doesn't mean they're necessarily opposing the interests of fossil fuels. Exactly can be said here. The same can be said for the CEO of Saudi Aramco, who has even more to play with, 200 billion of annual revenues in order to make that sustainability case. In the UK here, we have people like Mark Carney, who I'm not putting in either camp necessarily, but Mark Carney had pledges of 106 trillion at COP26, which is considerably more than the entire GDP of the world. Admittedly, this is over several years. And of course, where does that money come from? It comes from business, it comes from fossil fuels, it comes from vested interests. And all of this money goes towards shaping sustainability to move in the direction that suits the interests of the people who provide the money. And this is not simply an abstract issue. Policy is decided at forums like COP26. And COP26 and then more recently in Sharm el-Sheikh. All of these all of these meetings are defined increasingly by these kind of corporate interests. The politics of climate change cannot be separated from these economic influences, either at the level of what actually leads to carbon emissions or at the level of what we decide to do about it. And the way that this works is technically known as shifting the Overton window. Essentially, the more money you have, the more resources you can put behind your opinion, then the more you can shift public opinion in the direction that you like. So here's some quotes from the Daily Mail in Australia, for example, that said, in 2022, why net zero is dead unless Australians go vegetarian and suffer very high inflation. Again, this shifts the Overton window slightly more towards a conservative policy on sustainability. Then we can have the oil celebrity who, like Greta Thunberg, is saying things like our house is on fire, which gets a lot of traction and begins to move people towards more radical action. Then we have more conservative papers such as the New York Daily News saying climate zealots versus New York homeowners and workers, pitting the two against each other and pushing things back once again in the direction of a more conservative economically perspective on sustainability. And essentially, what this process means is that the more money you have to put behind your opinion, then the more often it gets out there, the more shifting happens in your direction. And so we end up with politics that reflect the interests of the status quo, and not just high-level politics, but opinions within the public themselves, which also reflect those views. So let's have a look at what was actually agreed at COP26, which was the last major milestone in our climate political forum globally. We agreed to pursue efforts to limit global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees and keep them well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial times. We agreed to limit greenhouse gas emissions from human activity to the same level that trees, soil and oceans can absorb naturally, known as net zero, between 2050 and 2100. We agreed that each country will set its own emission reduction targets reviewed every 5 years to raise ambitions. And we agreed that rich countries will help poorer nations by providing funding known as climate finance to adapt to climate change and switch to renewable energy. All sounds pretty good. And indeed, it was presented in some ways as positive steps, even though not nearly enough. However, let's have a look at what we didn't agree. What COP26 didn't essentially demonstrate was that wealthy countries are able to move the emissions outside of their national borders and thus lose responsibility. So the subtext of everything we saw in that agreement is that nations are responsible for their own environmental impacts. So that means a country like here in the UK, we've moved so much of our manufacturing abroad, and if we just continue to move it to other countries, then we're keeping up with our nationally determined agreements, even if we're not actually reducing the amount we're consuming or reducing the carbon emissions associated with our consumption. That's a massive loophole. Because of loopholes like this, despite the positivity that surround many of these agreements, we're actually nowhere near getting towards the pledges that we are supposed to be. So, for example, you'll remember that first COP26 pledge was that we will keep warming to 1.5 degrees, or at least as far below 2 degrees as possible. Well, if everybody accords and rigorously sticks to all of the agreements they've made so far, as of 2021, 2022, the amount of warming that we'll see around the world is not 1.5 to 2 degrees, it's 2.7 to 3.1 degrees. That's the trajectory we're on. Essentially, we have a situation in which our climate politics promises one thing and nevertheless presents the tools to only deliver something far less convincing. And what are we left with as people? Well, what we're left with essentially is not an effective climate politics, but individual actions. This is the thing that we're presented with every day. The idea that we can simply consume our way out of the climate crisis. If only we would care more, and if only we would buy less, if only we would be more careful in our purchases, then we could all solve the climate crisis together. But this, as we've seen today, is essentially an illusion. Anything you put in your basket has the same long, complex, impossibly enmeshed and entangled supply chain that developed over hundreds of years that we've just seen today. Bananas, for example, are one of the most environmentally polluting commodities that you can get because they need so much pesticide to get through that thick skin. Batteries are associated with massive environmental destruction wherever they are produced, and yet, of course, we do in many cases need to buy batteries. That's just simply a necessary commodity. Even dairy milk chocolate. The cocoa's fine, that's not too bad, but then think about the impact of that milk. Many people, even if they don't eat meat, still continue to eat chocolate, and even if one person gives up, are we really going far enough to untangle that huge global economic system which has been hundreds of years in the making? I would certainly argue not, because ultimately, as consumers, we simply do not have the information necessary to tackle that vastly complex edifice of the global economy. And this ultimately is the crux of carbon colonialism. We are the products, we are the subjects of a system of environmental domination, hundreds of years in the making. And yet, we do not view ourselves as subject to that global economic compact. The narratives which tell us that, in fact, this economy can get us out of the problem it's created are as fundamental a part of the carbon colonialism we face as the underlying economic structures that release the carbon that so troubles us today. So if we want to get around carbon colonialism, we need to begin, for a start, to challenge the narratives which emphasize individual action and emphasize the status quo. And we need to begin to unpick the dominance of the global economy in our current sustainability thinking. Thank you all very much.